'Tis the season to give to something that's not corporatized and not propagandized. To become a patron of activist news from the front lines, visit patreon.com/actout. This week in a special episode, I've got some questions. What makes a news outlet a Russian propaganda site? Did the Russians actually hack or leak or in any other way tamper with our elections? How safe and fair are our elections? And could voting machines be used for something more fun, like, playing PacMan? And finally, journalist Mnar Muhawesh joins us to talk real versus fake news. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Now, you may have noticed the recent eruption of Red Scare 2.0 propaganda, whether it be the Washington Post doubling down on their Russian conspiracy theories by publishing this headline. A few mere days after weekly walking back on, but not retracting, their grotesque article suggesting that anyone criticizing the U.S. empire is indeed a Russian spy and a peddler of, quote, fake news. That list includes WikiLeaks, who have, by the way, never been accused of leaking false information, The Drudge Report, Truth Out, Truth Dig, Naked Capitalism, Black Agenda Report, Antiwar.com, and others. From libertarian to hard left, seemingly the only thing that all of these sites have in common is their vehement critique of the U.S. empire. But no real experts, as noted in the article's headline, would confuse real adversarial journalism with Russian propaganda, right? Meet Propaganda or Not, aka Prop or Not, the supposed experts behind the big story whose website conveniently just went live a month ago and has been battling the evils of propaganda since 2016. And apparently only specializing in Russian propaganda. That's interesting. Fun fact, kids, if your government and media are doing it, it's not propaganda. So intense is Propernaut's hatred of Russia specifically that they even have a plugin so that you can thoroughly avoid any and all meanie stupid head critique of Uncle Sam, which again means it's Russian. And their criteria for flagging a site as fake news from Russia? Well, it's a bit vague, but pretty much anything that rails against the U.S., Obama, Hillary Clinton, U.S. allies, the mainstream media, Democrats, center-right, center-left, and moderates, among others. They further suggest that these, quote, Russian propaganda outlets be investigated under the Espionage Act, the Foreign Registration Act, and other related laws. At the same time, they vehemently deny being McCarthyites. After all, they just want anyone on their list brought before the FBI as possible traitors. Cool. Meanwhile, it's still not known who is actually behind this organization, where they get their funding, and whether they themselves are tied to any government agency. But fuck transparency, right? That's so Obama campaign 08. And by the way, all together now, we love Obama. Tack on to this the fact that Prop or Not has routinely, since their Twitter account first opened earlier this year, engaged in Trump-like Twitter tiffs with people who question their, quote, research, calling them, quote, fucking fascists and angwy, that's with a W, angwy Putinists. Stay classy, Prop or Not. Furthermore, the site used to list allies who it turns out had never heard of them. Awkward. So let's circle back to the Washington Post and why a media outlet would release an article that uses baseless evidence put out by a shady group of reactionary juveniles just to make Russia look bad. Well, The Intercept sent out a message to Craig Timberg, the author of the Washington Post article, asking him if, quote, he thinks it is fair to label left-wing news sites such as Truth Out Russian propaganda outlets. Timberg replied to this, I'm sorry, I can't comment about stories I've written for the Post. Quoi? I thought those would be the only kind of articles that you could directly comment on. You know, the ones that you fucking wrote. But alas, instead of commenting, the Washington Post merely offered up a meek statement saying that, quote, the Post does not itself vouch for the validity of Prop or Not's findings regarding any individual media outlet. Again, I've only been a journalist for 10 years. Isn't it your fucking job as a journalist to vouch for the validity of what you write? Because if it's not, I guess you're some fake news peddling motherfuckers. The irony. Clutching their Kill a Commie for Mommy t-shirts in one hand and an American flag in the other, the Washington Post then doubled down, saying that Russia stole the election, again a mere few days after stating that their job is not to validate what they put in their articles. Mainstream media then used that article as the foundation to disseminate the story that Russia hacked our elections. Be afraid, and also punch a Russian. In the article, Washington Post claims that intelligence agencies have identified individuals with connections to the Russian government who provided WikiLeaks with thousands of hacked emails from the Democratic National Committee and others, including Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, according to U.S. officials. Okay, I'm waiting to hear how that equals hacking an election, but I guess we'll get back to that in a minute. The article then goes on to flip-flop more times than a cornered Hillary Clinton. For example, quote, intelligence agencies do not have specific intelligence showing officials in the Kremlin directing the identified individuals to pass the Democratic emails to WikiLeaks. So, is it Putin and friends, or is it not? Come on, guys. The article then points out that Assange himself has said the Russian government is not the source, and also that both the White House and the CIA, the source of this new information, declined to comment. Furthermore, the article also points out that several members of Congress who attended the top-secret briefing at the Capitol are unconvinced that the underlying information is legitimate. Also, not included in this article, but important to note, the overseers of the U.S. intelligence community, aka the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, has declined to support the CIA's claim. So did they do it? Did they not? The suspense is killing me. I just gotta know who to hate. But before you grab your dusty anti-Russia swag, let's dig a little bit deeper and look back at the Podesta leaks from earlier this year. The affirmations of Russian involvement in those email leaks have come from, as one journalist puts it, guys on Twitter, some independent researchers, and private security firms, one of which, CrowdStrike, were hired by the DNC in late June. All of this intelligence power and all the evidence comes qualified with use of words such as possibly, appears, connects, and indicates. Well, to me, that indicates that you don't actually know shit. For example, in November, The Guardian released an article suggesting that Russia was tied to the Podesta leaks, writing that, quote, one hacking group in particular, known to cybersecurity researchers as Fancy Bear and believed to be operated by the Russian GRU intelligence agency, may have helped to coordinate the release of some information acquired from the Democrats. Okay, it says believed to be, may have helped, and some information. But god damn it, that sounds juicy, doesn't it? But wait, if you click on the Fancy Bear link in that Guardian article, you'll be taken to yet another Guardian article that writes, the bears, meaning Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, have three important things in common. Expensive digital tools suggesting state sponsorship, an interest in pursuing sensitive, embarrassing, or strategically significant information rather than financially beneficial data, and a choice of targets that align with Russian political objectives. Hold on. So the only way that you can have expensive digital tools is to work for the Kremlin? God, then I know a lot more covert spies than I thought I did. Also, choice of targets that align with Russian political objectives? God, that's vague. And really quite reminiscent of the proper not bullshit suggesting that if you criticize the U.S. government, thereby not criticizing Russia, you're a Russian spy. Or simply the fact that seemingly both Prop or Not and this article appear to have missed. Is Russia really the only country that has an anti-U.S. policy tip? Or do we just think that we're way more popular than we really are? Maybe they were hackers from almost any country in the Middle East or almost any country in South America? Who knows? Although apparently this guy knows that they're not Russian. Former UK ambassador to Russia, Craig Murray, had this to say about the hacked election fiasco. I know who leaked them. I've met the person who leaked them, and they are certainly not Russian, and it's an insider. It's a leak, not a hack. The two are different things. Indeed, leaking emails couldn't be further from actually hacking voting machines, which, by the way, aren't online anyway. Murray goes on to say that the CIA's inaction when it comes to an arrest betrays their absolute lack of knowledge in this case. Citing the brutal crackdown on whistleblowers under Obama, Murray suggests that if they had absolutely any clue whatsoever who was behind it, they would have done anything inside or outside of the law to take that person down. Valid point there, Craig. And my personal favorite in his longer commentary on the CIA's Russian coup is this. It is extremely amusing for the CIA to be accusing another country of interfering in domestic elections, when interfering in other countries' domestic elections on scores of occasions is what the CIA has done to effect regime change for the last 70 years. So really, this is almost beyond satire. Yeah, that's a new level of irony. So with all this, from Assange to paid-off cybersecurity firms to a splintered intelligence community, is there any actual evidence that firmly ties Russia to our fakaked elections? No. But since we're on the subject of fakaked elections, let's talk about them, beginning with a look at the machines. Indeed, the issue of hacked voting machines has been an issue for the past decade and a half, and for some, even longer. Starting in the late 90s, a Professor Andrew Apple, along with his colleague Ed Felton, brought their students together at Princeton's Center for Information Technology Policy in order to hack voting machines. They programmed one to play PacMan, infected others with self-duplicating malware, and even found that you could buy keys to voting machine locks on eBay. There's a fun stocking stuffer. In short, here's the gist from this group of election hackers. The machines that Americans use at the polls are less secure than the iPhones they use to navigate their way there. Ouch. And several of these Princeton machine hackers went on to sound alarm bells across the country, particularly after the 2000 election when machine voting became increasingly popular, in no small part due to the recount effort in Florida that shifted blame to paper ballots rather than a corrupted voting process. Fast forward about 2 years, and Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, another misnomer doozy that dumped almost $4 billion into new voting technology in an effort to phase out punch card ballots and older voting methods. Of course, since they sprang onto the scene, voting machines have caused a vast array of problems. From machines not turning on to shady outcomes like one vote being subtracted from every 100 votes for a certain candidate in Virginia. Or how about fractional voting? Earlier this year, Black Box Voting, a nonpartisan investigative reporting site founded in 2003 and dedicated to reporting and educating on the subject of our election process and system, earlier this year, Black Box did a review of the GEMS election management system, responsible for counting approximately 25% of votes in the U.S., and found that a fractional vote feature is embedded in each GEMS application, which can be used to invisibly, yet radically alter election outcomes by presetting desired vote percentages to redistribute votes. This tampering is not visible to election observers, even if they are standing in the room and watching the computer. Use of the decimalized vote feature is unlikely to be detected by auditing or canvass procedures and can be applied across large jurisdictions in less than 60 seconds. So, way less obvious or fun than a game of PacMan. Tack onto that the issue of machines being over a decade old with unreliable software right out of the gate, and you might wonder, why the hell isn't there any oversight here? Funny you should ask that, because when the cybersecurity researchers at Princeton tried to dig into machine problems, the companies that make them blocked their path. Citing intellectual property as the reason to keep code secret, the company's only oversight is a voluntary federal accreditation process that relies on labs to test machines that are, get this, typically paid by the manufacturers and are usually required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Cool, so the only oversight of voting machines comes from the people who make the voting machines. Great. Meanwhile, the Election Assistance Commission, also created by the Help America Vote Act, was taken to court in April, accused of voter suppression via a blessing to several southern states to go ahead and change their voter ID laws. And the EAC doesn't even have the authority to do that, which might be why even the DOJ refused to defend them in court. But still, regardless of that fiasco, Kansas, Georgia, and Alabama went ahead and used EAC's decision as a green light to demand shit like a birth certificate from their residents. So, with all of this taken into consideration, I guess my first question is this. Why are we so concerned with foreign interference when it's quite clear that there are ass loads of domestic interference in our elections? If our government and their mainstream media bitches really cared about the integrity of our elections, they would have dropped the hammer on any one or several of these egregious barriers to democracy years ago. How about what happened in the primaries? What about interstate cross-check, where you just dump people off the voter rolls? How about voter ID laws, or the total clusterfuck that is our army of old voting machines? Are we really dumb enough as a people to shove all of that aside because Russia? Bottom line, there's no hard evidence of Russians tampering with our elections, but there are literal mounds of evidence proving that our own officials and party lackeys consistently tamper with not only our access to voting, but our actual votes. I know it would feel good and easy to just blame Russia, to think that we're in the right, they're in the wrong, and anyone who says differently is a fucking propagandist. But that's not how reality works. That is, in fact, how our own propaganda machine works. So instead of desperately clinging to a false narrative about international espionage in the voting booth, focus on how insanely fucked our system is, without needing any help whatsoever from foreign countries. In other words, focus on the fucked facts. Now, before we wrap up this week, I'd like to circle back to Proper Not's naughty list and speak with supposed Russian propagandist and fake news peddler Mnar Muhawesh, journalist and founder of the alternative news site Mint Press News. Take a look.
Well, I think what we're seeing is basically a re-emergence of Cold War rhetoric and this McCarthyist Red Scare. And what we're seeing, actually, the day that that Washington Post article came out with a list of fake news, supposed fake news websites, the EU actually passed this resolution to actually ban RT altogether from airing and broadcasting across Europe, even though RT makes up about like 0.1% of all European TV viewers, I believe it was. So it's a really, really small percentage. And they're accusing Russia of, dividing these democratic nations and spreading fear and propaganda. It's almost like they're projecting their own insecurities onto Russia. But they're using this Cold War rhetoric to justify censorship across the free world. I mean, if we think about the EU, all I can remember is like that free speech march across France after the Charlie Hebdo cartoon incident. And so, we have these supposedly, free speech havens like the EU and havens of the First Amendment and free speech here in the United States that criticize a lot of countries when they censor certain perspectives or political views. Yet we're right here in the United States getting blacklisted for doing our job and upholding the First Amendment. It's a scary time for alternative journalists and watchdog journalists because now this is kind of setting up the stage for censoring, news websites. I'll give you an example of what we recently went through. One of our articles, no, not one of our articles, but an article that we had re-syndicated onto our website about Muslims marching against ISIS in Iraq went viral. Viral to the point where it made the Facebook trending. Yeah, trending topics. And we were getting about 100,000 or more unique visitors to our website every single day for about a week and a half for this one article. And what happened is that BuzzFeed, our favorite friends at BuzzFeed, they went after Mint Press for publishing this article and called it a fake news story, which, by the way, it's not fake. Muslims by the millions were marching in Iraq against ISIS. But what they did in this article, and they used the pretense of this Washington Post article of, this blacklist of fake news, is they said that Mint Press is part of the fake news blast-listed sites. And therefore, we need to be really careful about taking these stories seriously, because the only other website, according to BuzzFeed, that had published a story to show that Muslims by the millions were marching against ISIS for the Arba'in pilgrimage in Karbala in Iraq was RT. So this story must be Russian propaganda. And so it's these little things that the mainstream media is doing. And what BuzzFeed did was publish a fake news article right there in outing real news stories.
So, because it's an interesting time because studies suggest that only 6% of the U.S. populace actually entirely trusts mainstream media, and yet they're lashing out at alternative media. So, do you see this as a time for alternative media to really take this stand?
Since September 11th, we've seen a major consolidation of media. I mean, I remember because I wasn't really old enough then, but I remember studying that in the 1980s and in the 1990s, the media was owned by over 50 corporations, and by 2011, excuse me, the media had now consolidated into being owned by just 6 corporations, and that number actually is continuing to decline into less corporate conglomerates owning the media. And so what happened was is people were getting the same kind of information. They were being fear-mongered to justify and to support the war on terror. And the economy in the United States was declining. And so what had happened is we start to see like this renaissance of independent and alternative media kind of erupt onto the surface to challenge this corporate media giant that had taken over the sphere. And so with that, I think that alternative media, people are starting to turn more to it, and to get real news. And it's scaring the heck out of these old dinosaur media companies. We are seeing this rise of new, supposedly alternative media websites like Vice News, like BuzzFeed, like Vox News. They're being invested in from, the same people that own Fox News. Rupert Murdoch's name is all over them. They have old money going into those organizations. So they're obviously trying to still control the media, but they're still failing because they're still pushing Cold War rhetoric. They're still attacking basically anyone who's not white and Christian, I'm sorry to say. And they're spreading fear and division. And so more people, like you said, about 6%, only 6% of people in this country actually trust the media. So it's a very scary time for them. And so what they're trying to do is to make themselves relevant and say, hey guys, these alternative and watchdog journalists are fake, but we're the real news guys.
Yeah, and I remember you did a great piece on Vice News and about how they have a whole show that's
Yep.
basically sponsored by Bank of America. So talk about the role of journalists in this, not just because of Trump's presidency and his own rhetoric cracking down on free speech and journalism, but the role of journalists now in separating themselves from the Rupert Murdoch alternative media and focusing on this real push to get the truth out there.
Well, it's extremely challenging and it's extremely difficult because we are up against these billions and billions of dollars of funding that's basically going into the old media to push certain narratives. And so we as alternative journalists have to be creative in the way that we start our organizations and push our news stories out there. But, we've done a good job. I know you've done a good job in giving coverage of stories that the mainstream media is not covering. And I think that's really important, is looking at stories the mainstream media isn't covering and giving those stories attention. I mean, just look at what's happening at Standing Rock. If we look at coverage from NBC and the major news agencies, I mean, they are literally parroting the same narrative as the police and the governor in North Dakota by calling the water protectors rioters, violent. But we have Democracy Now!, we have Mint Press, we have other alternative media journalists on the ground giving live coverage of what's really going on and showing the dogs biting the protesters and how the police are the violent ones. They're the ones who are not upholding their oath to protect citizens from tyranny.
So talk about sort of wrapping up here. I wanted to ask your opinion on what the best thing to do for people that aren't. I mean, is there a way to tell if something's really fake news or not outside of the fact that it's on Fox News or something?
When it comes to fake news, we have to remember that this isn't really about blacklisting news or censoring news. We have an issue with media literacy in this country. I just did an interview with Mickey Huff, who's the director of Project Censored, and he spoke to me about this very subject. He said, this is not about making a list. He's like, that's the worst thing you can do. The problem is we as Americans are not equipped with the correct information about what is real news and what's not real news. And it's because we are getting our news from the so-called fake news outlets, which are the corporate media. And so we have to educate ourselves and re-empower ourselves and put the power back in our hands, through education, through research, and through reading, because that's the only thing that we have against the growing state who's trying to silence alternative perspectives, is we have to re-empower ourselves with pertinent information.
Do you see that happening mostly online or mostly in the streets? I mean, education is such a hard issue, particularly in this country where education has been getting slammed for decades. And, you have kids growing up that don't even know who we won independence from. So this idea of education is really tricky. Do you see that happening in terms of building social justice movements in the streets or online or both?
It is actually both. I mean, today we have 6 corporations that control over 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. So it's very hard to break through the media monster that we have surrounding us. I mean, it's getting us from every direction, from the magazines in the grocery store, from the radio, from the little ads that pop up on YouTube, from, even online, we're bombarded with these corporate media narratives. But yes, you're absolutely right. It has to start from a grassroots movement. We have to break away from the chains of the corporate media, and we have to start our own movements and really question even our own beliefs. I think that's where it really starts, is question our own beliefs and have a paradigm shift, a revolution within our own consciousness about what really is the truth. If a message is teaching us to hate somebody else, then we should really question what's really behind the story.
So that was just a portion of our interview with Mnar. So to see more, check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Occupy.com. And with that, we'll wrap up this week's Dose of Dissent. Be sure to join us next week for a look back at this crazy year. And in the meantime, check out the last slide to see the sites mentioned in this week's show. And be sure to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/ActOut.